Good morning. You've sat through several days of testimony, several days of evidence, and now based off that evidence, the state is asking for a conviction, but not the defense. No, we're asking that you take all the evidence, all the testimony into consideration, and return a verdict that is based off that evidence, that's based off that testimony, a verdict of not guilty. You've heard a lot, you've seen a lot, but you also haven't heard a lot, and you also haven't seen a lot. There are holes, there are gaps, and there's reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt, it can come from the evidence, a lack of evidence, or even a conflict in the evidence. Now, you've heard from several witnesses throughout the course of this trial, and you've heard from Mr. Todt as well. And in some regard, each of those witnesses in some way has some interest in this case. And that's one of the factors that you can look at in determining credibility. Now, you also heard when we talked about that Mr. Todt has the absolute right to remain silent. He has the right not to talk, not to testify, but he chose to do that. Now, one thing that the state said, and I'm going to agree with them, they said that the defense is going to harp on the medical examiner's report regarding the blood. And that's right, because that's one of the places that you can find a reasonable doubt. The medical examiner, Dr. Nara, she did the autopsies for each of the members of the family. In terms of all of the members of the family, there was that Benadryl, and that she couldn't identify or specify that it was or was not a cause of the death. Now, she wasn't able to determine if there was smothering or if there was a strangulation or anything of that nature in terms of each member of the family. So if the medical examiner can't rule out and give you the true cause of death, that goes towards reasonable doubt. Now, in Megan, in addition to the dihydroxymonothing, she also indicated that there were stab wounds. Now, in terms of Zoe, Alex, and Tyler, she indicated that while there were stab wounds, there was no hemorrhaging in the abdominal cavity, which means that the stab wounds were post-mortem. Now, in terms of Megan, there were the two wounds. They were about 8 inches deep and about 1/4 of an inch apart. Now, she indicated that there was hemorrhage inside of Megan's abdominal cavity, and she indicates that those indicate that the injuries were sustained while she was alive. In addition to the Benadryl, that there also was some ethanol, some alcohol potential. Dr. Nara, when she initially was doing the autopsies, Detective Cross told her that this was a case of strangulation. And in doing her medical exam, she wasn't able to confirm that, and she wasn't able to deny that. But she also talked about the Y and the L incision and how that stab wound did occur before death. Typically, the incision wouldn't be straight like what we had in this case if the person was moving or if there was a hesitation. There was none of that in this case. She indicates that it was homicidal violence, but she also defines what homicidal violence means. It just means the act of another person. She specifically indicated that homicidal violence does not mean premeditation. Dr. Nara did indicate that there was some strangulation and asphyxiation as well. She was told about this possible suicide note and suicide pact. Now, Dr. Nara did tell you that Benadryl, it can be toxic. Yes, it's an over-the-counter medication. It can be used for sleeping and for itching. However, if it's taken in higher doses, it can cause cardiac issues, especially in children. It can, in some cases, also cause death. Now, she's been involved in about 12 other Benadryl autopsies where those were suicide cases. While she said it's rare, because people typically might choose other drugs or narcotics, Benadryl could be used to not only commit suicide or cause overdoses. Now, Dr. Nara also talked about how the brain can be a good source of information. And specifically in terms of Megan's brain, there was that ethanol, which she believes means that there was some alcohol consumption before death. The knife wound on Megan, she couldn't tell, like I mentioned, if it was self-inflicted or not. But she did indicate that with a knife wound for a potential suicide or stabbing, she looks to see the location to make sure if it's something that they can inflict themselves. And in this case, we have two abdominal wounds that are about 3/4 of an inch apart. She also looks potentially for injuries to the mouth. No injuries were observed to the mouth, so she didn't cut into the mouth to look for it, which could have been caused by punching or being smothered with a pillow. None of that was observed here. Based off of the medical exam that was conducted by Dr. Nara, she also collected those samples that she sent to the Stewart Laboratory, where Ms. Carswell, the forensic medical toxicologist, conducted the toxicology, drug, and alcohol testing. The most important thing was that dihydroxymonothing, was found in each of the kids. It was found in Zoe, it was found in Alec, it was found in Tyler, as well as in Megan. Now, based off of this, as well as in Megan, there was also that ethanol level. There was no heavy metal testing, and there was nothing else that was done because Ms. Carswell was acting essentially at the direction of Dr. Nara, and Dr. Nara was getting her information from Detective Miller, who was getting his information from Mr. Todt. We also heard from Dr. Stern, who was the veterinarian, and he talked about the autopsy that he conducted on the canine. He indicated that the canine was severely decomposed, but he also indicated that there was a dental disease and a collapsing of the trachea within the canine, within Breezy, that was found. And Dr. Stern couldn't tell you how Breezy died. And while there was a wound, he can't say that that wound was a stab wound because of her being upside down. That could have easily been just a cause of decompensation. We also heard from the forensic toxicologist, Dr. Goldberger. Essentially, his whole practice is specifically on Benadryl toxicity. In each of the brain and the liver tissues that were tested, it was found to be present. Now, he indicated that he can't say that it was or that it wasn't the toxicological cause of death. He indicates that the levels were remarkable, which means that they weren't insignificant, they weren't incidental. There's something to note, there's something to look for. We have the medical examiner who can't say that strangulation or suffocation was or wasn't the cause of death. We have Dr. Goldberger who can't say that Benadryl was or wasn't a cause of death. So while we have an unnatural death, we can't even say what caused the death. So yes, the state is right. The defense is going to focus on that because that gives rise to reasonable doubt. That means they haven't proven the case beyond and to the exclusion of a reasonable doubt. We also heard from several different law enforcement officers who arrived to the scene. Now, specifically on the day in which they made contact with Mr. Todt, they indicated that they didn't knock on the door, they just walked in. And when they walk in, they see him at the top of the stairs. And he's shaking, mumbling, incoherent, kind of stumbling as he makes his way down the stairs to ultimately talk to them for several minutes. He says he thinks Megan's upstairs sleeping and things like that. Miss Seda, she was the primary technician at the case. She did most of her initial processing on the 13th, but she did end up coming back on the 15th to do additional processing at the direction of Detective Miller based off of his interview with Mr. Todt to look for other items of evidentiary value. Miss Seda, she indicates that she did that initial walkthrough of the house, but when she got there were numerous law enforcement. She wasn't really sure exactly how many, but there were several law enforcement that were on scene. They did a walkthrough with her, and they were to point out anything of importance or anything that maybe for her to focus on. They pointed out nothing. Ms. Seda did various processing. She indicates that the downstairs area of the house, clean, orderly, no issues, doesn't seem disturbed at all. She talks about the kitchen being clean and minus the trash that she collects from the kitchen trash can, as well as that downstairs bathroom. She talks about seeing some wine bottles and things like that were photographed but not ultimately processed or collected. And remember that Megan, that she had alcohol in her system. So there was no testing done on this bottle to indicate was there something inside of it? Was there not? Whose fingerprints are on the bottle? We later hear from Mr. Conklin a lot about fingerprints that came back to Anthony, to Mr. Todt. Ms. Seda does the initial documentation of downstairs, and then she makes her way upstairs. In the downstairs bathroom, before she gets upstairs, she notes that basically these Glade air freshener type plugins that are in that downstairs bathroom. Going upstairs, she photographs kind of the railing on the way up, and we see Benadryl bottle there and a phone. Throughout the time of her collecting, she sees adult Benadryl, children's Benadryl, liquid Benadryl, Benadryl tablets or pills, and even some wall drill ultimately outside. She thinks it was about 8 bottles total that she ends up collecting total with Benadryl. She talks about 2 knives that she collects, the 2 BB guns, the knife sheath, and some other items. The entire home was fully processed. She talked about a lot of things that she collected, but we didn't see necessarily everything that she collected because she also mentioned collecting some journals and some notebooks and things like that as well. She indicated that she also processed the note that was on the ottoman, this suicide note that the state was talking about earlier, and she was able to get prints off of that. Now, we didn't hear any testimony about any prints or whose prints were actually on this note or anything like that throughout the course of the testimony from Mr. Conklin or Ms. Seda, who was the one who kind of compared the prints. But on the 15th, like I mentioned in the beginning, she kind of goes back to the reserved place, to the main home, based off of the directions of Detective Miller. And at this point, the main focus is on the master bedroom. And at this point, based off of the interview, the detective is like, hey, look for these zip ties, look for this knife, look for, the red strap, these different things. Look for these BB guns, things like that. Now, we hear a lot about things that were collected, and the detective makes a point of pointing out and asking Mr. Todt, where did you get this from? Where did you get that from? What's the passcode for this? Which device were you using to search for it? That leads to lack of evidence. We hear him ask him all this questions, but we don't hear anything that Detective Miller does with this information. We don't see any phone searches. We don't see any Google searches. We don't see anything. The state talks about premeditation, how he planned this, but there's been no evidence or documentation to prove it. If we're going based on the fact that Mr. Todt said that they researched it all this time, Detective Miller is asking him, well, what's the passcode? Well, what device was used? Did you use this phone? We see nothing to back up any work that Detective Miller did to corroborate this information. Detective Miller took Mr. Todt at his word and decided, hey, my job is done. But deciding that your job is done doesn't mean that the state has proven the case beyond a reasonable doubt. What was done and what wasn't done gives rise to reasonable doubt. The blood on the knife was collected, but I don't believe they indicated it was tested. And the state talks about, they made a point of pointing out this bleach bottle. Ms. Seda said there was no indication to indicate that the bleach bottle was used, that no cleanup was attempted to be done, or anything like that. The state also indicated, once again, that the downstairs area was clean. Ms. Melendez, another forensic technician with Osceola, she went to the hospital on the 15th, and she took photographs of Mr. Todt. She took photographs of various injuries. You were able to see the photograph of him?
Yeah, come on.
Ms. Melendez made contact with Mr. Todt at the sheriff's office following his release from the hospital while he still had those EKG, ECG nodes on his chest and his abdomen. And she documented injuries to his hand. You can see a Band-Aid. She documented wounds on his left chest and on his abdomen. She also took some prints from him, collected swabs as well. Mr. Conklin, the FDLE analyst who kind of took all the DNA that was collected, and he did the comparison of those. Now, Mr. Conklin indicated that the swabs were collected from both of the knives. Basically, the swabs on the handle were consistent with being from at least three donors, at least one of which was male. Because of the fact that he had basically full profiles, those fingerprints for each member of the family, he was able to indicate that each and every one of the members of the family touched a knife that was found in their house. But he can't say when the DNA got there, how the DNA got there, how long it's been. We hear about the fingerprints that were collected from the knife and the different items, but we don't hear anything about any DNA. We know that Zoe, Megan, and Alec, as well as Tyler, were all stabbed. The only wound that was anti-mortem, i.e. before death, was Megan, because she's the only one that had the blood in the cavity that would indicate she was stabbed before. We've heard no testimony about any of the blood on the knife being hers. We've had no testimony of the blood on the knife being any of the other children. We've kind of gone through a rough overview of most of the evidence. Let's turn to the lack of evidence. We have these photographs of these receipts and these things. And while the state doesn't have to put forth a specific amount of evidence, we haven't seen anything that was substantiated, like I was saying with Detective Miller. He's asking all these things about, when did you do this? How long have you been doing this? For the state to try to tie it to premeditation. But we've seen nothing that would substantiate premeditation. But according to Mr. Todt's interview with law enforcement, he supposedly carried Tyler from downstairs. And according to him, Tyler is the quick one, so he had to be quick with the movement, and there was blood everywhere. But there's no blood in that room. There's no blood trailing up the stairs. There's no blood anywhere in the home except the master bedroom. And really, there's no blood technically anywhere because the medical examiners indicated basically all the blood had left. There was no blood in the body. So the only bedroom that has blood potentially is the master bedroom. That lack of evidence and that conflict in the evidence doesn't make sense. The state wants you to believe Mr. Todt's statement that he gave to law enforcement on the 15th after being released from the hospital. And they don't want you to believe what he told you about yesterday when he testified. There are, in the jury instructions that you have, some things that I want to point out. First, in terms of I was talking about the premeditation, it has to be a conscious decision to do so and must be present in the mind at the time of the killing. So the state is using all this and Detective Miller is using all this. You've been planning this for all this time to go towards premeditation, but there's nothing to really substantiate the premeditation. We've heard his testimony. Basically, it was Megan. It was Megan's idea. As the man, as the father of the house, he's essentially taking responsibility for it. But taking responsibility for it doesn't mean he was the one that committed the act and doesn't mean he was the one that did it. Just because he's taken responsibility supposedly after the fact doesn't change the person who committed the acts in the beginning. In Mr. Todt's statements, he talks about stabbing each of his kids. His statement is that each and every one of these occurred before the suffocation, before the death. His testimony and statement to law enforcement was that there was a stabbing prior, and then there was either suffocation or strangling after that. So essentially, stab, suffocate, strangle, death. But that doesn't coincide with what the medical examiner said. The medical examiner said that each of those stab wounds occurred after death, or there would have been blood in the cavity. So the state is essentially having you pick and choose when they want you to believe the defendant's statements and when they don't want you to believe his statements. They want you to believe that he did it, but don't believe the way he said he did it because it contradicts the actual physical evidence from the medical examiner, from the toxicologist, and from Dr. Goldberg as well. The lack of evidence and conflicts in the evidence, like I said, they kind of go together. You're supposed to consider his statement, and you make that determination from the evidence. So while his statement of he did it helps the state's evidence, his statement of how he supposedly did it completely contradicts the physical evidence that we have in this case. What we have is Mr. Todt taking responsibility and saying that he did it after after all of it was done, he's now taking responsibility to protect Megan, to protect the family, even in death. The state talked about how Mr. Todt was upset and crying during direct examination, but when she questioned him, he lost all tears. When she questioned him and was telling him, give me a yes or no, when he asked, can I explain? When she's questioning him and telling him, I want a yes or no. When she's questioning him and cutting him off when he's trying to answer the question and explain. He told you he's waited 2 years to be able to tell his story and to be able to talk. And now she's cutting him off and not allowing him to do so when he's trying to answer the question. He even asked sometimes, like, do you want a yes or a no, or can I explain? And she pick and chose when she was willing to let him explain and when she wanted a yes or no. Just like she wants to pick and choose when she wants you to believe his statement. Mr. Todt's statement does not agree with the evidence of the medical examiner. He explained yesterday why he took responsibility. He kind of explained the progression of him and Megan's relationship from the meeting, through marriage, through kids, and the various ups and downs they've kind of gone through. Does that evidence and testimony agree with the evidence and testimony that was presented? The state is required to prove each and every element of the crime charge beyond a reasonable doubt. That's something that we submit to you they haven't been able to do. I did it. The evidence, the proof, and the testimony presented here throughout the course of the trial has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Todt was the one that did these things. Megan did it all. He wasn't acting in her direction. He wasn't acting with her or in concert with her. He came home to his kids being dead. His wife was alive, but essentially dying. She stabbed herself in front of him and everything. The evidence and testimony shows that, okay, the DNA on the knife handle was everyone in the houses. But the blood on the knife, we don't know who that belongs to. It could have been Zoe. It could have been Tyler. It could have been Alex. It could have been Megan. That's all reasonable doubt. If it could have been, that means the state hasn't proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what you have, and I submit to you that based off of what's been presented, you won't have an abiding conviction of guilt. Yes, I understand that it might not be convenient to say it was Megan because she's not here to tell the story or anything. But to come home and to find your kids and to have to watch your wife kill herself in front of you is also not an easy thing to have to do. And it's because of this that we ask you to return the only verdict which speaks to the evidence, a verdict finding Mr. Todt not guilty. The state hasn't met their burden. They won't be able to fit the actual facts into the testimony and evidence presented here today. And I submit to you, members of the jury, that they won't be able to fit the facts into the elements, which is why you must return the only verdict which speaks to the evidence and the testimony that has been presented over the course of the trial. A verdict of not guilty in terms of the murder of Zoe Todt, a verdict of not guilty in terms of the murder of Tyler Todt, a verdict of not guilty of the murder in terms of Megan Todt, a verdict of not guilty in terms of Alexander Todt, and a verdict of not guilty of animal cruelty. Thank you.
Something that the defense did tell you that I agree with is when you're weighing the evidence, you have to look at who has an interest in the case. The defendant has the greatest interest in how this case is decided. The defense brought up the fact that you can find reasonable doubt because the medical examiner and the toxicologist and everybody can't agree as to a cause of death, but that's not the testimony that came out for you. The medical examiner told you that the cause of death was, for each one, was homicidal violence by unspecified means with diphenhydramine toxicity. Dr. Goldberger told you, due to the decomp of the bodies, that it's hard to say, because of the type of tissue that was left, whether it's the toxicological cause of death. Dr. Nora told you that she tried to look for signs of suffocation, these injuries that she would expect to see, but the state of the bodies is what has prevented her from doing that. You know why? Because the defendant kept them in the house for over 3 weeks as they slowly decomposed while he was there. That's what caused the medical examiner not to be able to look for those injuries. That's what caused the medical examiner not to be able to rule out all the potential causes of death. But she told you that the cause of death for Zoe, the 4-year-old, was homicidal violence by unspecified means. Tyler, who was 10 at the time of his death, same thing. Alec, 13, same thing. Megan, same thing. That Dr. Stern told you that the dog didn't die from natural causes, but again, they couldn't rule out suffocation because of the state of the body of the dog. Defense also talked to you a lot about premeditation and how the state hasn't proven premeditation, but one thing that you need to understand about premeditation, that premeditation can be formed in an instant. Premeditation doesn't have to be what you see in the TVs where it's this elaborate plan, although we have that here. The defendant told you that he's been planning this and looking at all of these videos since before Halloween. Now, the fact that you don't have the evidence, this is the defendant's phone, he went and looked at this website, and this is Megan's phone, she went, look at what you have. You have the children all positioned in the master bedroom. You have Megan in the master bedroom, you have the dog in the master bedroom, you have this altar in the master bedroom. You have rosaries in each one of their hands. And you know who's alive in the house? The defendant. There is no reasonable doubt in this case. The defendant's statement to law enforcement, yes, you have to decide whether it's freely and voluntarily and knowingly made. You have to make that decision. But there's absolutely no evidence that the defendant was threatened or forced to make any statement to law enforcement. In fact, the defendant is eager. He tells Detective Meller, hold on. I want to make sure that I get this right. I did it. Just get this over with. There is no reason not to consider the defendant's statement. The fact that Dr. Nora testified that she didn't find blood in the abdominal cavity of Alec or Tyler, I want you to also think there was no blood, liquid blood in either anybody's body because of the state that they were in. He said for Alec, he was behind Alec and reached his hand around until Alec died. And he said that he had to put a pillow between the back of Alec's head and his face so that Alec didn't headbutt him. You heard him describe how Tyler died and how they had to be quick so that Tyler didn't warn the neighbors that apparently weren't there as of yesterday. So Tyler didn't warn the neighbors because he was fast and they were afraid he was going to get away. There is no reasonable doubt in this case. And the state's confident that you're going to convict the defendant for the crimes that he committed.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 5-minute recess.